Apology from Raymond, our chairman, who's running a bit late, on to agricultural duties, which, as every farmer knows, is a wee bit heavy and imposition this time of the year. He's also suffering from a heavy cold, so he's asked me to sort of run through things tonight. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we're favoured with the presence of one of the country's leading experts on migration, the movement of people. That covers the whole subject of population movement, whether it be inside Ireland, whether it be from Ireland to England, Scotland, Wales, or of course to Australia, New Zealand, Canada and America. So Dr. Patrick Fitzgerald is a lecturer and development officer at the Study Centre for the Migration Study Centre in the Ulster American Folk Park in Owen. He's also been a lecturer at Queen's University in Belfast since 1996. In fact, one of his students is in front of me here tonight. Previously, he was associate member, assistant curator of migration studies at Ulster American Folk Park. And this fine book here, Migration in Irish History from the plantation basically to modern day, has been written by Patrick himself and Brian Lampkin. And a lot of you have met Brian, who in fact is the husband of Dr. Ken Muir, who was here the last night. So that closes the circle. I won't bore you with any more, other than to say, over to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a very real pleasure to be here this evening. It's always nice to be asked to come and talk to any local society, but a fledgling society, if I can call you that, 6 months or so in this particular pleasure, and to see a number of people from the local area who are coming out to the local historical society, and seeing you adding to the jigsaw of local historical societies that there are, not only across the province but across the whole island, because you are history at grassroots level, and it's a very real pleasure to welcome you. I'm a bit vexed that Brian and Ken managed to make it to the hog roast and I didn't. But apparently there are more hogs, so I'm told. So if you have another hog roast, I might make it along the road from Seskin where I live. As we're saying, what I'm trying to do this evening is the book that we published the end of last year, Migration in Irish History, is a survey of Irish migration history, but we think it's the first book that has sought really to look holistically and in an integrated way at these three dimensions. We're used, of course, to the story of emigration as a huge part of our history, but trying to look also at the two complementary dimensions of human migration: movement into Ireland, movement within Ireland, and the story of movement out of Ireland. And what I want to do to try and make it a little bit more localised this evening is to focus in not just on the sort of whole island, but to look at the province of Ulster and look at what may look initially to be familiar patterns of migration, but hopefully to say something new about those patterns of migration. And then towards the end, try and bring it out a little bit more locally to this particular area by using the now wonderfully online 1911 census to see if we can spot some migrants in your local area. We are. First of all, a word of congratulations to you. I'm very impressed with your website. But there's not many fledglings can manage to get such an impressive website up there. Now, I don't pretend to be on the cutting edge of digitization and such things myself. I'm a little bit old-fashioned. I'm feeling terribly old-fashioned these days for a relatively young man. But the websites are very important, and it's a point of contact for a lot of people, not only within the local area, but actually what's interesting is the idea of thinking about the Galician Clonese diaspora. All the people around the globe who have this connection back to this place, whose stories began here, be it 50, 100, 150, 200 years ago, and that this is one presence that they can tap into in the search that so many of them want to mount from Australia, New Zealand, North America, back to finding their roots here. So again, that's one thing, maybe you're thinking about that. About integrating the family history and the story of the diaspora into your own website. So let's kick off with this magnificent painting. a depiction of the scene of the Flight of the Earls. Here we are outside Rathmullen on the 14th September 1607. I'm just going to throw out a question to you. Does anyone care to guess when that painting was actually created? When that painting was painted? Anyone? There's no prize now. I have no prizes available, but fire. Do you think?
1804.
Lovely, right? 1804. We've got that. Very specific. I'm looking for a clue now. Right. Anybody else? Alright, well the point about asking that is that, I mean, again, you've given us an answer which is the early 19th century, and it is a very traditional 19th century kind of canvas. It's another thing when you look at it, you say, well, that was done 100 years ago or more. But actually, this was painted as late as 1958 by a Limerick artist called Thomas Ryan. So, I mean, that's one interesting point about painting. But in many ways, the reason I've selected that is, of course, that the Flight of the Earls, Hugh O'Neill, not least, who's pictured here as the centrepiece of the painting, this was an important, hugely important event in the transition from what we think of as Gaelic Ulster of the 16th century through to the 17th century, the beginnings of plantation. So at one level, we could pin it as the development of the starting point, at least in a symbolic or iconic way, as the beginning of the modern Irish diaspora. We've all heard a lot since Mary Robinson talked back in the early 90s about this thing that some people thought was a drug, diaspora. How many do it take? The Irish diaspora, a way of describing that huge community around the globe of estimated between 70 and 100 million people who have a special bond with the island of Ireland through historic migration. So in a way, that I think is an origin point. That's what we can pin as at least symbolically being the start of the Irish diaspora. But in many ways, the Flight of the Earls and the painting can also be thought of as a gateway. What I mean by that is that whilst the picture is about departure and the beginnings of a movement to continental Europe throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries, it's also because of its role connected to the beginnings of plantation, the Earls making way for the immigration that follows, can be thought of in a way as a kind of a gateway. So as we start to look at British settlement in the 17th century, just to make 2 points, I think one of the things when we think about Ulster, we tend to think about the plantation, the Ulster plantation and British settlement from the perspective of here, from the north. But of course, British settlement had been going on before the official Ulster plantation in 1609. And indeed, if you look at it, the concentration of British settlement just before the official Ulster plantation is in a way that can be presented as a kind of frontier spreading out from the Pale, the area in which British settlement previously had been densest. If we go forward to the middle part of the 17th century, one of the important points that is brought out is how important towns and the development of villages and towns were in terms of establishing a British presence on the island of Ireland. And one of the other points, and I will come back to this a little bit later on, but I was giving an interview this morning on the Walls of Derry about plantation actually. But again, here we think about the Ulster plantation, but have you ever heard anyone talk about the Dublin plantation? No. We don't think of it because there wasn't a Dublin plantation, but Dublin was immensely important in the story of British migration to Ireland in the 17th century. Dublin made the transition from a city of about 5,000 to 10,000 people at the beginning of the 17th century to a city of 80,000 by the end of the century. And the most important thing fueling that very spectacular growth was Protestant British immigration during the course of the century. So not to forget how important Dublin was as a plantation and British settler hub in 17th century Ireland. Another issue which I think is quite interesting is the way that we look at the story of British immigration into 17th century Ireland. I still think that a lot of people tend to focus on the Jacobean plantation, the early part of the century. That's the story of plantation. And that by the time of the Rising of 1621, this thing is secure. That is the story of the plantation of Ulster, is really the early part of the century. But actually when you look at, first of all, estimates of the population, one of the things that stands out is how light and sparse on the ground the British population actually is after 3 decades of plantation. 40,000 British migrants spread across the entire 9 counties. That's a very, very thinly spread population, particularly in the western part of Ulster. If we go forward to 1670, the population has tripled, and if you go forward to the early part of the century, it's accelerated quite significantly, doubled from 1670. So what I'm suggesting to you is that we simply need to take more account of how important the migrations of the second half of the 17th century are. Really, the process of making Ulster British, particularly the process of making Ulster Scottish, is very much to do with the second half of the 17th century. And I just want to focus on that particular point for a moment. I think a lot of people still miss the particular significance. If you said to me, which decade in the 17th century is the most important decade in terms of understanding how Ulster turns out throughout the 18th, 19th and 20th century, the decade that I would pick out is the last decade of the 17th century, the 1690s. This is the key decade for actually migration into Ulster and shaping the Ulster that then progresses through the subsequent decades and centuries. The establishment, the winning of the Williamite War, the story of the Battle of Boyne and so on, is really about establishing security. And what landlords in Ireland and Ulster want to do following the war is to attract tenants from Britain into Ulster. They're offering very good leases, very favourable leases to tenants who are coming over from England and also predominantly from Scotland. And it's this decade which sees really a very rapid expansion of the Presbyterian Church in Ulster, setting up some of those tensions that would mark the 18th century between Protestant dissent, Presbyterianism on the one hand, and the Episcopalian or state church on the other. But why is it then, as I would argue, the 1690s have tended to be less prominent in the popular construction of the whole story of plantation and British settlement in the 17th century? Well, I've mentioned the pull factors that are attracting particularly Scots to come into Ulster in the 1690s, but a very strong migration which saw perhaps 40 to 50,000 Scots coming in that one decade also needs a push factor. And the push factor in Scotland in the 1690s is famine. Very severe famine between the years 1695 and 1699, driving out of Scotland significant numbers of poorer migrants who are coming to Ireland. Now what's interesting about that, I think, is that it very much kind of subverts our popular stereotype or construction of the British planter coming to Ulster as an opportunity seeker, as a migrant coming drawn by opportunity purely in Ireland, not somebody driven out of Scotland by famine. So in a way, the idea of a planter coming to Ireland, if you like, as a famine refugee, changes, I think, very significantly the way that we construct the experience. I'll not open up the second one because I know I'm going to struggle for time. I've got too many slides here, but we'll press on. If we look at the patterns, I think what's very interesting for all of us who look at our area and drive through the rest of the landscape is picking up the differences in terms of the influences of English and or stroke Welsh, or on the other hand Scottish patterns. We still see them in some respects in our landscape today, but the broad patterns can broadly be presented as a sort of north-south split. The main patterns of Scottish migration into the province came through north down, through Antrim, particularly down the Bann Valley, also through the Greater Foyle Valley and into East Donegal. Those were the areas of predominant Scots migration and settlement over the course of the century. On the other hand, represented in blue, the predominant pattern of English, particularly Western and Northern English migrants, was into Belfast Lough, although of course Carrickfergus was a bigger town than Belfast at that stage, down the Lagan Valley, across North Armagh, the Clogher Valley, and west into Fermanagh. Those are the broad outline patterns that serve to describe the main thrust of migrants coming from Britain in the 17th century. I just put this in. This is actually a cider production yard in Portadown in 1908. And of course you'll know that Scots, not that I've ever come across, have much tradition of producing cider. Who produces cider? Those from the southwest of England. Just one way of pointing to the Orchard County's origins in terms of the people who planted in that area of North Armagh, coming from particularly the south and west of England. Just to introduce again another important point introduced initially by Philip Robinson in his book on the plantation of Ulster in the mid-80s. This idea that he coined and described as colonial spread. I think the idea of plantation tends to kind of give us the idea that these individuals who came and settled, they lacked agency. They were government controlled, and they took them from a particular place, many of their family, that planted them in a particular place in Ulster, and they weren't meant to move. They were there. That was where they were put. But of course that's not the way real migrants operated. Real migrants who came here were looking for the best opportunity available. If they were tenants, they were looking for the best deal, the best lease, the best economic opportunity available to them. And what they did was to spread out and move across the province. One good example of that is to imagine yourself as a Scottish planter who makes his way to an undertaking, a land allotted to an undertaker in this part of Ulster, in West Fermanagh. It's barren, upland, poor quality soil. They look at that and they then begin to familiarise themselves with that territory. They look at what lies west and they see the ancient medieval port of Sligo. They see somewhere surrounded by very rich resources of timber, and what do? They don't stop at the border of Fermanagh and say, well, I can't go out of here because this isn't part of the local plantation. They go west, and in fact Sligo, by the end of the 17th century, is arguably the most Scottish town in the north of Ireland. So that what you're seeing is people taking the best opportunity available, going to the places that they wanted to go to, and using a medieval port like Sligo to make contact not only back to Scotland, but also through trade links out to Europe. So people didn't obey the boundaries of the official plantation of Ulster. Now, to make some effort to try to bring it back to somewhere close to where we are, just to pick out one individual, Sir Toby Caulfield, who of course will be familiar to you. We take and have done in our field trips our students to the Caulfield, Castle Caulfield itself, tucked in at the back of the village as it is. But what a splendid and ambitious building that is in terms of trying to build a structure like that in the early 17th century in Tyrone. And Caulfield, of course, was, and I'll just read actually what we have, because it does feature in our book, so I just picked out what we said about Caulfield. One such newcomer was Toby Caulfield, born in 1665 in Great Milton, Oxfordshire. He came to Ireland first with the Earl of Essex in 1599 and stayed on to be rewarded with handsome land grants following the flight of the Earls as collector of the Earl of Tyrone's rents. Energetically clearing the woods in what had been the heartland of Tyrone's territory, he simultaneously reduced cover for woodkern and wolf, provided material for his splendid new home, Castle Caulfield, and made a massive profit from the timber to boot. He was a model Elizabethan prospector, settling on the frontier, the achievement of church and state objectives coinciding more or less with his own. So I think, again, Caulfield is a wonderful example of somebody who sees the most easily accessible way to make money rapidly in Ulster, timber. And that was what attracted the eye of many planters. When the London companies, for example, were attracted to come across to take part in the plantation of the county of Londonderry, they were really enticed by the more fertile land in the north of the county. But once they became aware of the huge forest resource here along the Bann, that's what they wanted. That's what they were interested in, because that was what could be turned into capital quickest. At the same time as it was a century of immigration, it's also, as I indicated, a century of emigration. Just looking crudely at some of the figures, we're looking at the predominant movement out of Ulster in the 17th century to continental Europe, particularly to France and Spain, the two major Catholic military powers on the continent. There is also migration that was hard to estimate across to Britain, and there is also migration to the Americas. But as I said, it was the migration to Europe that was very significant. And in some ways, I think we can think about that migration as part of a safety valve in terms of how those new British planters in Ulster would have conceived of the movement to continental Europe. Because it was voluntary migration, as I said, to Flanders to fight for the Spanish, voluntary migration to the Catholic powers of continental Europe. But there was also a concerted effort to transport forcibly significant numbers of the woodkern from places like the Fuse in South Armagh, who in 1610-1611 were transshipped from here in Carlingford Lough off to the Protestant part of Sweden in significant numbers, thousands of them. The story of what happens to them is too long and complex. Some made it back to Ireland, some ended up in Scotland, some actually ended up in Sweden, some, believe it or not, ended up with Hugh O'Neill in Rome. So it is a strange and disparate story, but it is part of that story of both voluntary and non-voluntary migration out of Ireland. At this juncture in time, we probably don't think so much about transatlantic migration. We know that there were migrants from Ulster who made it to mainland continental North America by the later part of the 17th century. But the largest single migration from Ireland across the Atlantic at this juncture was actually not to mainland North America at all, but to the West Indies and Caribbean. It's estimated that about 30,000 migrants made their way from Ireland, more particularly from Southern Ireland, particularly Munster, during the course of the decades from about 1660 through to the end of the century. And there are islands such as Montserrat that are referred to in the Caribbean as the Irish Islands. Moving into the 18th century again, the process of immigration did not entirely stop in 1700. Again, we tend to sort of think, well, that's the end of the story of immigration from Britain. Well, it wasn't. It certainly slowed quite decidedly, but it did continue. One historian, Nicholas Canny, suggests that the flow was reduced to about 10,000 in the period from 1700 up to 1775. So Protestant immigration from Britain is continuing after 1700, just at a significantly reduced rate. But there are also new streams of Protestant migration into Ireland, two of which can be pointed to as being assisted migration, if you like, into Ireland, offering refuge to refugees from the continent. The first of these from the German Palatine around 1710, 1711, just about again to be commemorated this year. Again, assistance to come and settle in Ireland. And most of that settlement occurred in, again, the southern part of Ireland. The other one, of course, were the Huguenots who came following the invocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. And in many ways, these were migrants who punched above their weight, not least in terms of the contribution that they made to the development of very fine linen cloth, the production of fine linen cloth. And Louis Crommelin, commemorated here with his colony of weavers at Hildon, just outside Lisburn, was a very significant player in the development of linen in the later part of the 17th century in Ulster. Again, there, in terms of thinking about internal movements, and this is one that I think people are probably again less aware of, with the onset of the reduction in direct migration from Britain from the early part of the century, landowners throughout the island still had a preference for Protestant tenants. The question was now, where do we get our Protestant tenants? Well, what they did, many of them, was to look north to Ulster and seek to entice colonies of Ulster, particularly Presbyterian weavers from Ulster, to come down and establish themselves on their estates. For example, outside Ballina, the Earl of Arran set up such a colony. Another one here at Gamer House, Rosscray in County Tipperary, not marked on the map. Also in Cork and Kerry, we see examples of these colonies of northern weavers being enticed to come and settle on southern estates, trying to, as it were, stimulate the production of linen and start what would have been called proto-industrialisation, the beginnings of the industrial process, raising income for the estate. Again, links to the south that existed in the 18th century are also sometimes we are less familiar with these today. One example of that, again, links to linen. We should realise that the Linen Hall in Belfast is not in fact built until the 1780s, 1782. So if you think it up, well, where do you send your linen to be exported and marketed prior to that? Well, I'll tell you where you send it to Dublin. And there are very strong connections through trade between particularly South Ulster and Dublin throughout the 18th century. This is the site of the linen market, the Linen Hall in North Dublin. And interestingly, the three streets which surround it give us some clues, because the names of the three streets that surround it are Lurgan Street, Antrim Street and Coleraine Street. And that isn't accidental. It's telling you that that Ulster connectedness and Ulster migration is an important part of what that hidden heritage of connection between Ulster and Dublin going back to the 18th century. Now, to turn to my own native county of Armagh, and the troubles that surrounded the period of 1795 and the Battle of the Diamond, just outside Largo. That, of course, Armagh was, and particularly North and Mid Armagh, areas of intense competition. Competition in the sense that it's one of those areas of the North where the balance between Church of Ireland, Episcopalian, Presbyterian and Catholic was very evenly balanced, and all three groups are in strong economic competition in the later part of the 18th century. And of course in the 1790s in particular, this leads to significant sectarian violence in that area, which culminated to some extent in the battle. Well, it's referred to as a battle, that might be a little wrong, but certainly the violence that occurred around the Diamond in 1795. But also what's interesting in terms of migration is what happened after the Battle of the Diamond in terms of what can be referred to today as a pogrom. Many Catholics who lived in that vicinity, again, being posted with notes to quit, and they migrated and got out. Many of them went west to Fermanagh and beyond into Mayo. The names from that area can still be detected significantly in places like Westport in County Mayo. But not only within Ireland itself, people left with evidence that people from that area also established a presence in Western Scotland in the years immediately after the Battle of Diamond in 1795. So again, the consequences of the sectarian conflict feeding into migration. Moving to look at emigration in this period, you can see an important switchover. In the years between 1680 and 1750, North America clearly comes into the predominance as the main destination for those leaving Ulster, although Europe still in the early part of the century has a significance. Britain still there on the radar, but a relatively small number. The second half of the century, we see a significant acceleration in the volume of migration across the Atlantic, a significant decline in migration to Europe, and the beginnings of migration on a larger scale, particularly in the last quarter of the century to Britain, and also into the British Empire. Much has been written about the migration of the 18th century. Dixon's book, dating back to the mid-60s, Dixon was a nobleman, in fact, writing in the mid-60s, a very reliable still piece of scholarship in terms of telling us about the migration of that period. Some of the more recent revision would perhaps stress a couple of points. Certainly I think the estimates that were offered by Dixon and others may, in terms of largely Presbyterian emigration from the north, be exaggerated. The original figures suggested 250,000 immigrants leaving Ulster for North America are probably somewhat exaggerated. It's very difficult to be precise in relation to the statistics, but it's likely on the basis of the work of Vocek and others that that number could be moderated to perhaps 100 to 120,000. Also, Vocek is looking at Ulster emigration alongside German emigration as the other main stream into America at that time. Would also suggest that the migrants who came from Ulster had more capital, by and large, than the migrants who came from other Irish ports. That more of the migrants leaving from Waterford or Dublin or Galway were going as indentured servants, whereas more of those who are able to leave Ulster in the time phase are actually people who have their own capital and are able to migrate, not as indentured servants, but as fee-paying passengers. And I suspect part of the answer behind that is to do with the establishment of what we refer to as the Ulster custom, that when you surrender your lease, you're actually due compensation, which comes in the form of capital to allow you to purchase your own fee to pay your way to America. Just again to give a note to local work and the master's course which we run at the Centre for Migration Studies. Evan Carnwell, who actually is the education officer at the Folk Park, but did undertake the 2-year master's course, produced this book, this master's thesis, Emigration from East Rome to Colonial America in this time phase, 1776. So if any of you are interested in that theme, I would commend this to you. It received a distinction. It's a very fine piece of work. One other very interesting aspect to migration, which doesn't always get fully acknowledged, is bearing in mind the importance of what we call military migration. Now, there are many very interesting documents in the history of Ireland, but this one is one that I've always thought of as particularly interesting. Can anyone, even in the band, focus on which language is this written in? Right. It's an Irish language document, and it's published by Dublin Castle. This makes it extremely unusual. It's so unusual that I don't, and I've asked this question I've been for 70 years, nobody's ever come up with an answer. I don't know of any other document that has been printed by Dublin Castle as an official British government document in the Irish language. So it tells us that something rather strange or particular is going on. And what it really is a recruiting poster. This is your Kitchener, Your Country Needs You of 1806 in the Napoleonic Wars. It's setting out what the regulations for service are, and it's in the Irish language. And what it's telling us is the huge drive to recruit, not only in Ireland, but across the west of Scotland, the Celtic fringe, if you like, at the height of the Napoleonic Wars. And what it reminds us is how important the Catholic Irish recruits were in filling the rank and file not only of the army but also of the navy during the course of the Napoleonic Wars. It's estimated that something like 150,000 Irishmen served in the forces, the British forces, in the years between 1793 and 1815. So it's a huge number. It's much bigger than the number, for example, who at the same time went to America. So it's a very important and significant aspect of the story of migration. And then if we look at Lady Butler's painting of 1879, Gone for a Comet Ranger, again, the two young recruits from the west of Ireland in the 1790s, just on the cusp of the Land War, leaving the small village in Kerry, bound perhaps for the garrison in Tralee and migration on. And so many of those individuals didn't return. They went and settled in places like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada and so on, or were given land grants in places like that. So it's part of the story of migration in the 19th century. The empire is also an interesting dimension of this whole process. This is related to a conference held in Derry commemorating plantation, but they chose a title, Laboratory for Empire. And what is interesting, in fact, as a pattern, is the extent to which those families who are established in Ulster during the course of the plantation and subsequently during the 17th century, how important a role they actually play in the story of the development of the British Empire subsequently in the 18th and 19th century. They're very prominent as administrators in the military and so on in the development of the British Empire subsequently. And one area where, again, that presence crops up but has not perhaps been as recognised as it should be is in the subcontinent of India. The Irish, as this book compiled by Eileen Houston points out, the Irish were in India. They didn't settle in India and establish a population in the same way, to the same extent as they did in other parts, such as obviously North America or South Africa, New Zealand, Australia. But during the course of their service, they were a very prominent and important part of the story of Ireland's connection to empire. And then to try to bring it back to here, how does that link to where we are this evening? Well, this house was sold in 1771 by the Earl of Charlemont, James Caulfield, to this man, Einar, I think you pronounce that, but is it Einar? Yeah, Einar. Burgess, it's a Welsh name, but he's not from Wales, who came from East Ham in Essex, but that's not what he needed money. To buy a place like this, he needed a lot of money, and he did that through service in the East India Company. He was the paymaster of the Navy, in fact, of the East India Company. Now, what I think, and I haven't done any further research on this, but I think it's quite interesting, there is strong evidence that a lot of those planter families in Ulster were involved in the East India Company in the 18th century. Not that far away, the Earl of Caledon. Again, the money that built Caledon came from India. So it's an interesting speculation. Was there a link between Burgess and Caledon? Somebody maybe, I see some people don't know anything about it. Maybe that research is already underway as we speak. As we move into the 19th century and thinking about immigration, and again remembering that immigration continues from Britain, and again using my Armagh background a little, Gosford Estate, Market Hill. Well, we're thinking, who are these who are coming in the early 19th century? Well, in the Gosford Estate, he actually set out to try to attract what were called Scottish improvers. Land agents who knew how to rationalise in the state and give agricultural advice. For some odd reason, Irish landlords in the 19th century had a highly vaunted view of Scottish agriculture, and they thought everything in Scotland was brilliant. I mean, a lot of the more recent statistics suggest it wasn't the case at all, but they thought the Scottish agricultural system was the bee's knees, and they attracted on the Gosford estate no less than 60 such agricultural advisors to come across and to improve not only that estate but other estates, because once they came in, other estates wanted to borrow, or bring in a Scottish improver. Another important point, of course, was the extent of garrisoning of Irish towns, such as Golf Barracks and Armagh. So another element of the presence that existed throughout the 19th century, where not only again the military, but their wives and families as well. Other strands of migration and immigration into Ireland that are of interest. In the later part of the 19th century, migrants from Italy are beginning to turn up in Belfast. Now, I'm sure all of you know where this is. That's the spirit. The Crown, quite literally, the Crown Liquor Saloon. Why does the Crown Liquor Saloon have such a magnificent interior? Well, so the story goes, is that the owner of the bar, his son was doing architecture at Queen's in the 1860s, and went off, as they did, on the grand tour of Europe, and went to Italy, admired the fine interior fittings of many places in Italy, comes back to his dad, says, "We're going to refit that." Dad has to be persuaded of this investment, but we can cut it down and make this cheaper. How are we going to do that? Somebody says, well, we're going to get moonlighting. We're going to use the workers from Italy who are fitting out the Catholic churches in West Belfast, as they were in the 1860s, 1870s, and also fitting out the liners that were being fitted out with this very fine interiors down in the shipyards. So the story goes, and I stress so the story goes, that is how the Crown ended up with that very, very fine interior, due to that Italian presence in Belfast. Certainly there's evidence that Little Patrick Street and York Street, that area, in the 1880s and 1890s, was an area very heavily populated by an Italian community. In the 1890s, we see the beginnings of a significant influx into Belfast of a Jewish community, largely from pogroms carried out in Russia and Eastern Europe. And they're coming in and they're settling, although this is the upper part of the White Rock Road, the Jewish burial ground, which is still there. They're settling in large measure around Carlisle Circus, the bottom of the Antrim Road. I mean, until as late as the 1950s and 60s, there was still a quite distinct Jewish presence in that area. But like a lot of Jewish communities in the smaller European cities, what happened in Belfast was they tended to go either back to to Israel or to places like New York, where the infrastructure in terms of synagogues, special butchers, so on and so forth, was more conducive. There was, of course, spectacular migration into Belfast at the same time. The figures are quite extraordinary. In many respects, Belfast is an excellent example of a city drawing on its hinterland and on rural-urban migration. At the beginning of the 19th century, its population is a city of no more than 20,000, and it expands, but it really takes off from the 1870s. The last quarter of that century, it virtually doubles its population. And by 1901, it has outstripped Dublin and is the largest city on the island. So what we're looking at here is an extraordinary story of internal migration. Now, much of that migration is drawing in initially on a wider Ulster frame. In other words, from the 1820s, 30s and 40s, Belfast is drawing on a wider Ulster frame. What happens in the later part of the 19th century is that it actually constricts. Most of the migrants who are coming in to Belfast tend to be drawn predominantly from Antrim and down by the 1870s, 1880s. Now, I've just thrown this in. I can't prove that this is, in fact, a collegial migrant. But it's just using the 1911 census. I took a name like Donnelly and put it in, and hey presto, I came up with one person who you can see here. The rest of the family are recorded as being all being born in Belfast City. But this is the mother-in-law, Eliza Donnelly, presumably the mother-in-law, the mother of Margaret Moylan. And they're living, written down here. They're living in East Belfast. Can't Definitely. But the point, of course, is I'm just using it as an illustration of one migrant from Tyrone who's coming into the city at this point in time. But the online census for 1911 is a hugely significant and important resource for family history. Not all of the migrants who are moving in the 19th century are moving permanently. In fact, the story of migration on a seasonal basis to go and undertake agricultural work in Britain is hugely significant. By the 1860s, it's estimated that something like 150,000 migrants are moving every year from Ireland to Britain to undertake agricultural work and then return. This is the Scotch boat which linked Derry with Glasgow again. And even as late as the 1940s, 1950s, people would have been going across on a seasonal basis across the Irish Sea. In terms of internal migration, the railways were critically important in conditioning the growth or decline of certain urban centres. This is Portadown railway station, and again I haven't got it out right because I'm from Armagh, but what happened, of course, when they decided to make Armagh branch line and Portadown then on the main Belfast-Dublin artery was consequently the significant growth in the population, near doubling of the population of Portadown, whereas Armagh's population began in fact to decline about 30%. So the impact of the railway in establishing Portadown as a marketing hub and as a hub that would attract rural migrants in, critically important. Somewhere a bit more close to home, just to take a look at the population of Dungannon, which may be something that you're already well familiar with. But again, what's interesting, and I don't know the answers to why these particular population trends have occurred, but you may do. But just to pick out some of the features, you've actually again here got a bit of a decline between just from 1821 to 41. A slight decline, but limited decline, really, very limited decline, virtually static during the course of the decade of the famine. And over the course of the post-famine decade, you actually have significant enough growth. Again, limited growth there, but where really Dungannon's population expands significantly is in the period from 1937 through to 71, and then further expansion through to 2001. But what struck me as being interesting was the scale of the doubling of population in those decades, which isn't actually mirrored by all towns in Ulster in that time phase. So I don't know what in particular your explanation for that might be. Is that right? There you are. Simple as that. Right. Industrial employment basically is yeah. So just again, taking a quick look at some migrants. I just want to use the 1911 census to try and pick out some individuals. This is William Street, 2 William Street household. And we can see that this is a lodging housekeeper, a widow. Her name is Ellen McVeigh. That is listed there. If we go further down, staying in that lodging house, we can find in 1911, in 2 William Street in Dungannon, the following individuals, all of whom have great Cork names: O'Leary, Cashman and Barry. And they're there because they're telegraph men, all 3 of them, lodging in Dungannon. So again, just interesting that there's an example of some migrants in Dungannon. And again, another example, this time Northland Terrace, 3 Northland Terrace, the Barr family. Now, this is interesting because this individual, James Barr, is a police constable, RIC constable, and his wife. But what is interesting is they again, Donegal born. And that is interesting because one of the things that was moving people around across the island of Ireland in the early 20th century was the RIC, because you were not meant to serve in your home county, so they moved you purposely around. And a lot of intermarriage between Ulster and other provinces, Leinster, Munster, common marriages, I think the voting of them related to the presence of the RIC in the north. The other one that I found over the years is railway. The influence of people who worked on the railways also spread people around the island. So that is the story of the Bars. Now, I couldn't help but put this one in because it's just so interesting. Does anyone know where this might be or have a guess?
Is the Rod School?
Rod School, yeah. The Royal School, these are the boarders who in 1911 were there. And just as a sample, an interesting mix again between Presbyterians and Church of Ireland. But people whose birthplace was India, the United States, England, Dublin, Belfast and Wicklow amongst the boarders who were lodging in Dungannon at that point in time. Moving to Ballygawley, I hope this isn't too boring. But it's just to get across the idea of these migrants and places where it might be. This is a man called William Abernethy, who is listed as a physician and surgeon. And he is at number 119 Ballygawley town. That's Abernethy. Is that ringing a bell, William?
Yes.
Right? Interesting. Well, you'll note that he again was born in Derry, listed there as Londonderry. His wife is from Limerick, and I think it's the first daughter is born in Dublin, and then the remainder. So it gives us some information about not only where his wife came from, but how did he meet his wife in County Limerick, and his daughter being in Dublin suggested that he did his medical training plausibly in Dublin.
That's not great aunt.
Sorry?
I think one of my great aunts is the Millie Duff, Marianne Duff.
Oh, right. Oh, sorry, right.
Second of all.
Oh, very good. There we are. Good, we've got a connection. 22-year-old. General servant. Very good. Because that's another interesting dimension of the households that have servants, about where those servants came from. I just thought this was interesting, a long way from the coast to put it. But this is a county down. He runs in Ballygawley. He's a fishmonger and newsagent by the name of Dorian. Alexander Dorian and Patrick Dorian, the son. Now he's from County Down, or born in County Down, the son born in County Monaghan. But there they are selling newspapers and fish. Maybe the fish wrapped in the newspapers and stuff like that. In Ballygawley in 1911. Right, now interestingly, next door to 119 Abernethys, on 120 was listed. So my eyesight was not as good as it should be. Well, this is the Church of Ireland rector, okay, who was born in County Sligo, with a wife who's born in England, and then one of the children who's born again in County Sligo, with the other two born in Tyrone. So again, the Church of Ireland rector and minister moving around the island. So to come in a little bit closer to look at Castle Caulfield. Now here the pattern of population. You'll interestingly note that between 1841 and 51 there's really minimal change in the population during the course of the famine decade. What is striking is the quite significant decline in the population in that decade from 1831 to 1841. You were commenting earlier again that this is a wider pattern in the area, the wider rural area, of significant population decline in this area in that decade before 1841. But there again you can see the figures reasonably static through, but that huge jump between 61 and 71. So what's the explanation for such a
New council houses.
Is it?
Yes, the
Yeah, well that would make sense.
And there was Castle Coffee Weaving Factory.
Right, okay.
From 1873.
Well, that's 19, that's up between 61 and 71 now.
Yes, right.
But it is a very big jump. But okay, I just wanted to then take a look at migrants to Castle Caulfield. I don't know if you know any of these names. This is a pension. This man, Morris McNellis, John McNellis. No, Morris Collins. Sorry, I'm getting the wrong one here. Morris Collins is a retired RIC. He's a pension from the RIC. Okay, and he is married to Ian Collins. He is born in County Cork. So in the role of the RIC, retired RIC officer, 866, here at Castle Caulfield, born in Cork. Okay, this is John McNellis, and he is at, you'll have to keep me right on the town land names, I'm on like K. Liston Monaghan.
Yes.
16 Liston Monaghan is where he is. And,
Trish's neighbour.
sorry?
Trish's neighbour.
Okay. Still?
No, he's gone now.
Right, okay. This is where it gets interesting. And he is a national school teacher. National school teacher, but from County Donegal. And then also in the household, and this may be, although listed as a lodger, probably his family, because I can't make out the first name, but also McNellis, I think, but also County Donegal and also a school teacher. In this one, this is just 18 Eden Cranham.
Eden Crown.
Eden Cranham.
You're about 5 minutes walk from Eden.
Well, now, this is what I thought was interesting, because I think this may well be a number of domestic servants. They're listed there as servant domestic, if you can just make that out. Right? So the interesting point is where they're working here. Yeah? Alright. Howson, the name of the family is Howson. Howson. And again, birthplace is listed as England. He was born in England, then others born in England, and others in Tyrone. But again, I suspected that they could well be involved, because they're all listed, the whole family is working as domestic servants. That's what I suspected. Yeah. And finally, I thought it. Now, how am I doing for time? I've probably got too long.
No, you're fine.
In terms of giving office was about immigration in the 19th century. So, looking just at the scale of immigration in that 70-year period from 1820 to 1890, and again, people often have this idea, Ulster-American immigration they tend to associate with the 18th century, but actually the scale of immigration in the 19th century is huge in comparison, 7 times more significant comparison to population. So there you've got that massive migration across the North Atlantic, the involvement, and very, very difficult in fact to be precise about estimating population movement across the Irish Sea, because it wasn't recorded, because it's all part from the union of the same political state, and therefore there is no record kept on migration. But it's estimated in that range, migration to the British Empire, and a very sharp decline in migration to continental Europe. Of course, one of the things that's happening in that era of the pre-famine decades is the transition from a predominance of Presbyterians within the immigrant flow, particularly across the Atlantic, to from about the mid-1820s to a predominance of Ulster Catholics within the migrant flow. It's a gradual process. It happens at different speeds in different places, but that is the broad pattern during those pre-famine decades. Also important to recognise how important Canada is in those pre-famine decades. Very huge, significant movement. It's about 50% between the US and Canada throughout the 1820s, 30s and 40s. So that, of course, is a very important point. Linked through the timber trade through Derry, the bringing in of timber from maritime Canada and sending out of immigrants in the same direction. Of course, what dominates hugely our construction of the immigrant experience is the Great Famine. The association between the coffin ships, Black 47 and emigration is absolutely huge in terms of our perception and the way that we construct the immigrant experience. But I think there are some interesting twists and turns in the story of famine immigration from Ulster, because I think we undoubtedly tend to construct it as, if not largely, almost exclusively, as a Catholic story. I think Protestant Ulster still tends to have, doesn't see the famine immigration as part of its story. But I would argue quite strongly that actually it is, and it's a very important part of its story. Again, some of that piece of work which Brian has been involved in looking at this vessel, the Exmouth, which is just one random vessel set off from Derry in 1847, the height of the famine, bound for Quebec, but didn't make Quebec. It actually foundered on the west coast of Scotland on the island of Islay. But what we have in our database is a list of all of the passengers on board that vessel. And if you look at those names, and this is not a scientific method, but we're all lived in this part of the world for long enough to know that names send out messages about ethnicity and about background and about denomination. It isn't scientific, but I would suggest in the breakdown of these names that you could suggest that about 52% of the names are suggestive of a Native Irish stroke Catholic background, and about 35% are suggestive of a British stroke settler background. So what we're looking at is one vessel leaving Derry in height of the family 1847 with more than a third of the passengers on board Protestant, and many of them likely to be Presbyterian. So this idea that the Presbyterians weren't affected by the famine either through excess mortality or migration is simply wrong, and it's part of what I think you need very strongly to readdress that particular perception. I'll maybe just finish up with these three broad points about post-famine patterns, to pick out three major, what I would say are interesting features to do with post-famine immigration. The first one, beautifully encapsulated by Nichols' painting of 1864, is the fact that when we look at immigration from Europe as a whole in the long 19th century, we find that most of the departing immigrants were male, young single men. Normally between 2/3 and 3/4 of the immigrant flow from Germany, Scandinavia, Italy are young men. What's different about Ireland is that women are more heavily represented, so that the balance throughout those decades from about 1850 to 1900, the immigrant flow out of Ireland is roughly equally balanced between men and women. And most of them are young men and women, just like Nichols' painting here. Another interesting and important feature of the migration of that period is what the geographers would refer to as chain migration. Here, James Brennan's wonderful painting, The Emigrant Letter, 1875, shows us the young girl, now having received her education in the National School, reading the letter aloud to the family group in a cabin. And what that's doing is the connecting of one pioneer migrant from this family, sending back a letter and probably a prepaid ticket in the hand of the father to take another member, probably the elder daughter, out to join him in a particular place in America. And this, of course, is how Irish immigration operated. They didn't, in any family, tend to just go one to Australia, one to New Zealand, one to California, one to New York. What they did was follow intimate bonds and links of connection to a particular place. And these still exist today. And if you go in to any pub in any village in Ireland and start to talk to people about where the people from their area went to, you'll find that there's a lot of pattern movement to a particular place out there in the diaspora. So those bonds, intimate bonds of connection that connected families across the oceans and back to the home place. And the final point is an interesting one, an area to do with migration again, which was for many years understudied and is beginning to receive more attention now, is the whole issue of return, of coming back to Ireland. And I think I'm right in saying, to make the connection again with Parkinore, the man who bought this house in the 1950s, whose name I've now forgotten.
Thomas Doran.
Sorry?
Thomas Doran.
Yes, was a return migrant who had made his fortune in America selling cards.
Gift cards, yes.
Gift cards, and was originally from Castlecoffin and returned home. So he's one of these return migrants. But what's interesting about the Irish and return migration, if I said to you that of the 50 million migrants who left the whole of Europe and crossed the Atlantic in the long 19th century, what proportion of them do you think ultimately returned back across the Atlantic to Europe? I don't care to hazard a guess. Again, no prizes.
10%?
Alright, 10%? 30 to 40% is spot on. 35%. So it's actually, and that shocks an American audience. If I ever present that to an American audience at the full, they all say 2%, 3%, because we construct that as, this was the golden land of opportunity. Why would you go back to the old world of Europe? But actually, very large numbers did. Parts of Eastern Europe, 90% from the Balkans. 2/3 of Italian immigrants, they went back. What's different about Ireland is that Ireland has, of all the ethnic groups bar the European Jews, the lowest figure, according to the statistics, the lowest figure in terms of return migration. So, in many ways, emigration from Ireland was much more emigration for keeps. That the system was designed that the person stayed away. They sent money back, but they didn't necessarily themselves come back. But I think what's interesting is, I'm beginning, as time moves on, to question those statistics on return migration, because as I go out and give talks like this, and I can see people looking up here, they rush up afterwards and tell me, well, actually that's interesting because I had a great uncle or a great grandfather or somebody who came back, and in my own family in Seskinore, again, my wife were on the home farm. That house was built in 1913 by her great grandfather who returned. Great grandfather who returned and built the farm, having spent 7 years in the States. So it is interesting how what we're told by the statistics doesn't actually marry with a lot of the stories and the testimony of individual people and individual real families. So we'll leave it there. If there are any nice and easy questions, I'll take them. But thank you very much for your time, and I hope that that has been of some interest.
Thank you.
I think that was one of the most interesting talks, probably the most interesting talk we've ever had. It's relevant, it's interesting. Every little statistic you can think has relevance to nearly everybody in the room. You can start thinking about it. Pat here told me a great story about his family. Pat's an O'Neill, and his son was in Philadelphia, which is known as Ulster immigrants, or Tyrone immigrants in particular. Philadelphia is like sort of home from home. And when his son was out in business there, he met another guy of the same name, O'Neill, and not long after they first met, they established that they could possibly be related. And this gentleman's family that he met had in fact emigrated to the States from Liechtenstein in Coal Island in the 1870s. Is that right, Pat? And when Pat O'Neill gets hold of a thing, and anybody who's ever worked for him will know that he doesn't let go easy. So he decided to investigate this a bit further, and in fact they did some DNA testing, and they proved in fact the connection going back 5 generations back. A fascinating story. There's a whole lot of sub-stories to it, but I won't bore you, but it's illustrating of what you're saying. So from that point of view, it's very relevant, Patrick, your talk here tonight. I think everybody in the room thinks it was the most interesting talk we've ever had. I certainly do. I'm not undermining anybody else who's come here, but it's of such relevance to everybody in the room. And it debunks a whole lot of myths. A whole lot of myths that everyone thinks that it was only the Catholics who emigrated. Of course they did, but so did the Presbyterians. They had as raw deal as the Catholics did. And the other thing about it is that everybody thinks of migration, they think of everybody going to America. Well, tonight we find out that that's not the case. Willie, one of our esteemed members here, himself migrated to Shetland. And as a returned migrant.
I think there's a good story in that.
Yes. No, you weren't thrown out of it, no, you weren't. But it just illustrates what went on in Willie's lifetime, of course, went on in those times that we looked at. And it's just the same story, people moving for economic reasons, primarily. The same story also, there's a road between Queen's Corner to Carnfield and all the way into Upland. And right up that whole valley is a complete Presbyterian community. Am I right in saying that, Winston? Yeah, and Bob there.
Even in recent censuses,
yes. It is just a lovely sort of illustration of what you're saying about communities moving en bloc. So that still retains to this day that movement of population. And of course those people moved for the same reason that they had famine in Scotland. So they're not the descendants of some well-to-do landowners that, history has sometimes misunderstood and misconstrued and given their own message. So that debunks a lot of myths. And it also highlights that history is more often just a continuation of day-to-day activities that we're doing. Nothing more, nothing less than that. You have the things that are highlighted by wars and battles and all that. And battles like the Battle of the Diamond was really 2 or 3 dozen Orangemen and a few defenders having a right out battle at each other. That's basically all it amounted to. But it's blown out of proportion, just like a whole lot of other things are. But anyway, questions. I have plenty of questions for Patrick, but anybody questions, please feel free.
Patrick, can I just ask you?
Yeah.
One thing that fascinated us, we've been looking at things like the hard money roads. We know that the coffee settlement around here was made in the English family that says so in your man's survey, the Pinner survey,
Yeah.
you could see the house progressing over the 10 years or whatever.
Yeah.
He talks about 15 English families.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Scotch surnames on the planter side in this area. But there's very little either English or Scots names in the Hard Money Road at all in the area. You need to go into Dungannon or further afield towards Knockmcroy. But in our area it seems to be sort of blank. But one thing I discovered when I was looking at sort of local histories, there would have been a fair number of Scots settling around the time of the plantation and the lesser land once you move out of the village, as it were. But because of the Black Oath by 1638, I didn't realise till I came across a couple of Presbyterian histories, massive numbers of Presbyterians went back to Scotland.
Yeah.
I mean, literally in the thousands. I mean, is there any sort of established figures? Has anybody worked on that? Because it would perhaps explain now by the time you get to 1660, it's like they've disappeared. But then obviously when things settled down maybe after the vine, then they were coming back. Because that's the other thing that's recorded, they did come back. Once they felt the state.
Yeah.
So, but I can always historically believe, well, that might be because of the rebellion. But it wasn't just gone before 1641, it disappeared.
Well, there's two kind of things going on there in that period. One of them is Black Oath response to Wentworth's Black Oath, but the other thing is, again, economic and social conditions, because those 2 years have a very poor harvest. So again, that may also fed into this idea of a religious, or to get up and go, religious persecution combined with field harvest here, and that may also. But you see, I think the broader kind of construct is, and I mean, nobody's only missing a blow in one night, but in a way, what is interesting is that we still tend not to see the return migration, and none of these migrations were ever neat. You know, the idea that upon somebody lives somewhere in Scotland or England, comes, settles and stays in one place, that's it. These were where people were moving back and forth, and a number of them didn't return, some did return, some new people came. And that is, I think, what's interesting when you look in detail at the story of a place like Castle Caulfield, because I think it's interesting. I mean, I've been to Castle Caulfield a number of times now, and the original planters in Caulfield, you would have expected, would have been from England. And at what point did that Scottish presence begin to come into the population mix? But I would suspect that by the early 18th century, there's a significant Scottish Presbyterian community developing there.
Well, the only thing we thought was Monroe, sorry.
Yeah.
There seems to be connections. Sergeant Wells, the Wells family, I think.
Interesting.
Yes,
Well.
Sergeant Wells was part of Monroe's army, and maybe the Welleses had settled here.
No, but they came from County Cavan, the Wells.
Well, there's a particular connection here because despite my name, Fitzgerald, I'm actually a product in Meadows College. I was coached rugby by none other than David Wells. So, you know, that's one man I don't come to.
Go back to that list of names and that ship there.
I'm grateful for my name, Fitzgerald, the product. But American audiences love that. But no, that is interesting now again about the Wales. It was fascinating you mentioned that.
Or just the name had cropped up with something to do with Monroe's army, but as you were saying, there's a connection there with Monroe.
Cavan?
County Cavan, that's where they came from, maybe after 1920.
Right, okay.
Yes.
Right.
Also, you have the Wells family, or no, you have the Tanner family in Castle Caulfield, and they were Huguenots, and they came to the area around about 1699.
Okay, interesting.
How did the Huguenots? All these Colberts.
Yeah, Colbert, yeah.
It is much more complicated than, there's a tendency to fall into the traps of just thinking you have this date 1609 and you have this other date 1847 and another one, And the other thing I was going to say, in more modern times in the own family, and this is, I see it in another period, more recent times, the emigrations to Scotland for work at the turn of the century, because industry here just collapses before the the 1920 disaster. And Nelson just exploded, and they were having down the TV and everything else. They lost a couple of great aunts, whatever it was, during that period of TV. Great aunts, and then they came home.
Right, okay.
Usually what tended to happen was they ended up in the Island Light Infantry or something like that.
Yeah.
And then when the war was over, they came back here. When work started to pick up again. So there was again another period of migration.
You're actually living through a period of migration at the moment.
Oh,
Yeah.
we're always living through periods of migration.
This is particularly marked at the moment.
That's it.
The local football team here, the Gaelic football team, have lost, I think, 7 players in 1 year. 7 players. Think about that. All emigrated. Australia, America, England. So, it's
what you've got now, of course, like if people going to university and not coming back.
Yeah.
that's another form of immigration.
Yeah.
But the funny, interesting thing, is because of the economic cycle, that is so critical to condition whether people come or leave. But it was amazing that even only 18 months ago, there were people who were confidently predicting that the pattern by which the island of Ireland, North and South, would be a net importer of people for the foreseeable future. People confidently predicted that we were in the pattern that had really been set from 93, whereby we were seeing 70,000 in terms of public coming into the country every year. That just, it shows you how unpredictable it is. But there's only 2 weeks ago in the Irish Times, again, it reported that we've gone back to being a net exporter. And we don't know what next year holds or the year after that. That is just the nature of the way that the economy serves to dictate a very unpredictable pattern.
One of the other things you were talking about in the 1820s and 30s, Paddy, I did some family history, and I know 7 Holland families from Akenduff. Now, if you think about 7 families in Akenduff at the moment, or any townland in the area, leaving within a decade, that's a huge number of families. So if it's happened to the Hollands in 1820 to 1830 to 1840, it was happening to everybody else. Everybody else was affected because it was a terrible period of bad weather and economic depression, far worse than probably people understand, much worse than now. Because the demand for linen had dropped and disappeared and all that. So the communities that live in and around West Belfast and North Belfast, those places that have such dreadful reputations, are full of people, distant cousins of ours. And nobody has actually sat down and done, I don't think any of the demographics on that, as I understand it, did probably have it.
No, I think one of the interesting points is still, I don't know that people are as conscious in Belfast. A lot of people who are Belfast people say, I've been Belfast, I've always been a Belfast person. But the statistics reveal that actually that the vast majority of people have come in from somewhere, most of them from the middle part of the 19th century on. And that is actually still quite an interesting, when you talk to groups, we've had a number of Belfast groups where you begin to analyse that. And actually, when you go back a number of generations, they have still, often a faint, but still a link with somewhere. They're conscious of a link back out to rural Ulster somewhere that they came from into the city. And it is actually a very interesting kind of phenomenon. But it hasn't been, I sense it's not there at the consciousness level with people who think of themselves as Belfast people and for one reason or another don't want to make the connection.
Well, I think, like a lot of Dublin people, a lot of Belfast people think the world ends at the end of the M1,
We're in the red bus there, so we're going to.
That's right. But that's changed. I think that's changed. I think people are becoming more aware of their origins.
Well, I actually think those figures are there because I seen there where there was 1.3 million people left Ulster to go to America. And if you think about it, every ship that went was able to take 1,000 people. There's 1,000 ships. Well,
most of it would take 1,000. I mean, most of the men. No. Oh, yeah.
What proportion of each generation would you estimate? Well,
that was the point I'm just making. I mean, in terms of, I'm not saying to, but I think again, for a variety of reasons, people construct Ulster American immigration as being more 18th century. there is a tendency, I think, still to think of this that as being, but one of the reasons, even if you just look at the Presbyterian emigration doesn't reach its peak at the time of the American Revolution or any time in the 18th century. It reaches its peak in 1847-48 at the height of the famine. If you're just looking at Presbyterians, so this sort of construct again of the famine emigration and post-famine emigration being essentially or largely Catholic, and the emigration of the earlier period of the 18th century being largely Presbyterian, it isn't borne out with the statistics. And it kind of, in a way, also it does play into, the kind of popular literature that is out there about a kind of Scotch-Irish experience that I just pose a question about the validity of that kind of, I'm not saying that didn't happen. There was emigration by Presbyterians in the 18th century, but there's a dogged determination in that particular literature. I don't want to name an individual name, but there is an author who publishes large numbers of books on the Scotch Irish, but nowhere in any of those books is there any reference at all in 9 or 10 volumes or whatever it is, ever to the existence. There's no emigration stopped dramatically, at the end. It's accelerating like mad. And actually what I would pick out a date 1819, because 1819 sees Belfast and Dublin connect to Liverpool. And from that point forth, you're really talking about a gear shift, which sees the development of mass immigration. Mass immigration by Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Catholics, everybody. The scale of immigration just jumps. But it's interesting the way, as I said, that these things get constructed.
You were saying about the publication of Coffin going from 400 up to 600 or something in the 1950s.
It was a big jump forward, that.
But prior to that, that 4 mile between Coffin and Newtown would have been one heck of a walk, right?
It would.
Whereas, at that stage the transport system would have changed.
Right. Yeah, it's that 61 to 71. There is a very distinct. Well, really, going on for almost tripling in population, which is very striking.
It's a lot easier to get from Coffin to Dungannon.
Yeah. Housing is the development of council. Housing development. Of course, there are problems in terms of the 71 and 81 census in terms of their accuracy. It has to be admitted. The trend is certainly quite spectacular.
Would they have changed in those?
There is a possibility of a boundary. That is the other possibility of a redefinition of boundary. That is another. I only put these up just to give a very brief sort of. I didn't do the background, but that is another possibility that there was a boundary over these.
If you look up the Ofnacloy one, it makes very interesting reading in that it reflects the political thing here with the border. He showed when it was introduced, the population dropped way off, and then when it came to the war again, it dropped way off. It seemed to any political thing affected Ofnacloy quite a lot.
Right, interesting.
When he started the troubles, Ofnacloy dropped way off again. Yeah. It seemed to be because it was on the border to have a big.
Yeah. Well, I think basically I studied history to A level, but most of the history I learned, was brilliantly taught. But I now question the way in which it was taught, if you know what I mean. And I would question Raymond, who's our chairperson here. He was taught at the Royal School, and sometimes the way you're told a story is the construct that's put on the story that gives you a certain view of how things happened. But when you study the bare statistics of something, that is the real history. Do you know what I mean? Rather than somebody's view, a particular view of what actually happened. And that has been the problem. It's one of the problems that history and its interpretation of the history in this 6 counties or Northern Ireland, whatever you want to call it, has bedeviled the subject. Because everybody puts their own construct on it, their own interpretation and their own definition to suit a particular political viewpoint. And the purpose that we have of having this society is not necessarily to disagree with that, but to find out what actually happened and make up our own minds as adults about what happened.
I think that comes across very much in your website. Is because people, talking about a cross-community group that sets out to be a cross-community group, but I think that very genuine sense does come over in your website, and that is, but in a funny way, when I look back at being taught school, my dad was actually a school teacher, so the thing I find odd now actually is that if I was setting out to start to get a kid, even at a young age of 7, 8 or 9, interested in history, the place I would start is with their family. The place to start history is family history. And the explosion of interest that there has actually been in the last years in family history, I think, is a very, very healthy thing. And what you're talking about, which is a route way into the past, and this so often happens of an impression, very often an impression has been formed on the basis of a political agenda about what is happening today, that if you start with your own family story, it's interesting the perspective it gives you, because I know nobody on this island who has undertaken their family history and can say, well, it's exactly in accordance with the patterns that the history books say. They always say to me, I never expected the twists and turns and the things, the shocks, the changes, and their individual story makes them question everything they learned from then on. You know what I mean? So I just think it's a great way to get kids actually, and kids are brilliant at doing family history.
Yeah.
They can do it from the age of 7, 8 or 9. I've got my own, because I've been doing it myself. I was forced to do it. I was teaching family migration history for a module, so I actually had to go and do my family. And I found it really fascinating.
Yeah.
I found my grandfather actually as a boarder in Dungannon Royal as well, although he lived over on the other side of Loch Ness. But it just got me really interested, and then fascinated. What family history does is it takes you very nicely to local history. Because you want to know what was happening with the neighbours and what was the complexion of your area. So actually, family history takes you into local and community history, and from there it then takes you out to widen, out from there. But so what you're doing here on the ground, I think, is terrific.
I think though possibly the way that history is taught, I have to be very thankful to defend history teachers here, so but I think it actually has changed. We now don't teach the story. We teach the skills to go off and find the story themselves, So we actually we teach them to identify bias, to identify prejudice and all of those things right from the outset when they come into us in first year, So now we talk about the skills of a historian rather than just what the history story. So possibly that lesson has been learned, and that is one of the ways that we can resolve that, is actually trying to teach them.
Well, that's good to hear. That's good to hear, because when I compare what I studied for A level with Raymond and what he studied for A level, it's as if we lived in two different countries. You know what I mean? And we've had this conversation. Yeah. We had this conversation, and it's 40-year-old conversation. Glad to see it's changed in 40 years.
Thanks very much for your talk. You quoted a lot of text there, and I also want to writers on Irish immigration and immigration and immigration. How does that compare with other European nations? In the big picture, how does it compare? How does it influence us, our national characters?
There's a big question. I'll start with the first one. There has been more written about Irish emigration than is the case in most other European traditions. Although there is a great body of work in many of the major German, Scandinavian, there's a lot of work done. But then again, you've got to remember that proportionately, Ireland sent more immigrants out than any other European country, proportionately population. So it's not altogether surprising. There is significantly less written in the issue of internal migration, oddly, in Ireland than virtually any other European country. If I took you to Sweden or Finland or Germany or any of the major European countries, there is actually a significant body of research, published research, in relation to internal migration. If you went to something like Irish History Online, an online bibliography, and put in internal migration, you get about 2 items. It's extraordinary. That it is a major. There are other things. One of the things is that it's not as easy to detect. There is, if you think of the history of Dublin or Belfast, you'll find reference to internal migration inevitably. But there's not very much published specifically entitled about internal migration. How the writing has affected us as a people is a big one. But one thing is, again, about the way that we construct emigration. I mean, the whole issue to do with seeing emigration from Ireland as exile, and it's been, we have tended to construct the story of emigration as being exclusively a story of being forced out of Ireland and associated with pain and the horrors of emigration. And I think that began to be readdressed. I think one of the key things in doing that, and that was done consciously by Mary Robinson, was about using the diaspora term as a way of imagining, as much as anything, the relationship between the island and all of its peoples spread across the world in a more positive way. Just at that level, that there was an attempt. Because for a long time, emigration in the 20th century was something that neither party wanted to talk about, except in opposition. So that if you're looking, in the Republic throughout the 20th century, one party's in power, the other's not opposition. What do we do about emigration? And they get into power and they don't talk about emigration. It's one of those things, because they knew they could do very little about it, really. They could do very little about it. So I don't know if that really gets to kind of answer your question. It's a huge question. The other question, is our kind of fixation to a degree with the impact that these migrants had out there in the world. Whereas I would argue the biggest impact of all of the 10 million people roughly who left the island was here. And we often forget here and the people who stayed behind. And there's been some work done recently about the people who remained in 20th century Ireland, whether brothers and sisters or others left. And I think that's a very important point, sort of getting to your question. What was the impact of the emigration on the people who remained here? There's all kinds of arguments about brain drain and things that aren't positive for the people who remain on the island. And so I think that's an interesting area to kind of ponder.
I have friends in, not relations, I've got friends in Wisconsin. And over there, they have Swedes, they have Germans, they have Norwegians, they have basically every European country involved, and yet the Irish are the only ones who call themselves Irish American.
Yeah.
They're the only ones who keep their home nation as part of their nationality. All the rest is something as soon as they get over there, they get well.
Well, it is interesting. We do that quite a lot with groups, American groups, students who are small in the United States come probably about half a dozen a year, and you're talking to them about how they describe themselves. I would say, and one of the interesting things is where they come from in the States. But certainly, even in the last 10 years, I would have noticed a distinct decline in the extent to which a 21-year-old or 22-year-old American student who may only be third or fourth generation Irishman still is now less likely to describe themselves as Irish American. They say, I'm an American, first and foremost. I would never consciously describe myself as Irish American. I'm not hiding the fact that somebody said, are you Irish American? Yes, but they're not going around, So I think, things do change. And
I think that's a bit of post 9/11.
That may be, there may be all kinds of factors involved in it.
Also, a lot of them are mixed. No, the mother could have been Swedish and the
No,
father
absolutely.
was American.
In fact, a very interesting question in that regard is why people select or preference certain ethnicities in the States. For example, you could be, as you say, German American, Scottish American, Italian American and Irish American. You have an equal choice of 4. You could have 8, and you say, which one am I going to pick? Why are people selecting to define themselves, not only as a matter of say, as Irish American as opposed to the others? But that actually is a man called Reg Barron, who's done an interesting study, he's an anthropologist at Queen's on that whole issue, written a book on the subject. And that in fact is a very interesting why we privilege certain ethnicities over others.
Well, I think the Irish had more political influence, completely disproportionate to their numbers, particularly in the East Coast, from the beginning of the last century. You heard about the barroom, the smoke-filled barroom politics of Boston and places like that, and New York, where they actually ended up running the show, and they had real political power and real political clout, and it was a big thing or a popular thing to wave the flag when it suited. It's different now. It's a different sort of flag waving now because it's not just. I think Americans and everybody has a greater understanding of Ireland and its problems, and they don't tend to jump on the nationalist bandwagon as much as they probably would have in the past. I think they have a more sort of balanced view of the country, and the whole thing about being Irish American. I mean, I've relations in America and all that there. It doesn't dominate their lives the way we think it does. It's only very skin deep, I assure you. Yes.
There's another element too, like, over in Boston, I was in Boston about 10 years ago, and, there's a tour of Candy, just looking at different historic sites, and the guy highlighted that, America has a very short history, modern America, and the Irish were one of the first settlers, so they, for example, in Boston, were sitting in the harbour. Now the Italians are sitting in the harbour and they run Boston. So there's that search for a lot of the European people to actually identify themselves, pre-America as such in the modern day. So I think that's part of the, that search for the Irish American was an Irish settler and will probably have an advantage over a few of the other European nations.
I hired a car in Boston one time and drove through South Boston, and if anybody knows the city, South Boston's a bit like West Belfast. It's a dangerous area, and you have all the shamrocks all like there, but there's a high crime in it. It's a working class area, and it's not a lot of crime. There was a lot of crime back 10, 15 years ago in that time, and you probably read about all the Boston criminals. So not all of the Irish bit in America was that glamorous. Some of it was, there's quite a lot that didn't make it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is it true what you used to say about the Roman Catholics all going and set on the East Coast, and the Presbyterians and Protestants all heading west? In other words, is it true that the
It's a gross simplification. Again, that idea. Again, I think one of the things that sort of characterises the popular narrative of the story is divided into two stories. I would actually argue it's one story. They're both parts of one story, not two stories. But there is so in other words, the story of Presbyterian emigration is neatly encapsulated in terms of an 18th century story, and it's about settlement in Appalachia and how the frontier rose west. And then you have a gap, and this is one of the things I was very interesting, is there's actually this mysterious gap between the American Scots, and then it picks up again with the family, post-family Catholic story. It's the big cities, it's the Bostons, Philadelphia, it's urban, it's industrial. And what it actually is binary. It's one thing feeding off the other. It's about distinction. And a lot of our history, actually, to go back to your book, was written from the point of view from the later 19th century of actually distinguishing two different, separate. It's saying you're that, we're this, and not, and the story of immigration actually isn't one story, and that simplification just serves actually to hide a lot of the reality of what happened.
The Grant and the Crocker tend to bring that to the fore, like I said.
Exactly. The stereotype image of the frontiersman is, if you like, an emblematic or symbolic kind of hero figure that is representative of a particular simplification of the story of Presbyterian emigration to North America. It's not emblematic. It's not representative. It's somebody who people who want to choose to celebrate something. Again, it's all about sort of ancestry worship to some extent, which always makes me feel a little bit uneasy. Nothing is all good, it's about balance. It's about balance.
Something that you mentioned earlier on as well when we were talking about that and maintaining the Irishness and so on was the gender, the fact that so many Irish women, that equality is, there was times 50%, and there was that encouragement as well, to marry.
Exactly.
There was and the opportunity to marry. Irish and so on, and particularly with the church, the encouragement to marry your own kind and so on. And I think possibly that's contributed as well to.
It did. And what's interesting actually is the number of marriages where in the United States somebody from the same townland or the same parish is marrying in America. And part of that I think is to do with the great letters I've seen if you go to some of the database, where they need to know that the family at home know that person in the family. Because if they come from Cork and this is an immigrant from Antrim, it's a problem because they can't put them on their map. They can't say who that family is. You know, so there is a kind of a tendency, in fact, for a lot of intermarriage, certainly within the county. Then you also got to remember that they socialised a great deal around the county. The county was a tremendous hub in terms of socialising, and their world kind of revolved around that.
Well, Canada's even more fascinating in some ways. A lot of the Irish immigrants, I think from within Quebec, I read that up to 30% of the population of Quebec City is of Irish descent. But a lot of them got French names because when the Catholics came, the priests were French, they translated the names into French.
In fact, there's an article about that in a story written by a school teacher from Sligo who kept a diary as he emigrated from Sligo with his community to Grosse Ile in Quebec. And the epilogue to the little story that he kept, to cut a long story short, basically what happened was all the people on the boat died with sickness, including the school teacher and his wife. So there's an epilogue, and it's taken up by the school teacher's brother. And it goes on to say that there were so many orphans at Grosse Ile of Irish from rural Ireland who had lost parents on the ship over or died when they arrived in Grosse Ile from fever or whatever it was, or TB or whatever it was, that these children were then adopted by French families in Quebec, in the province of Quebec, in Montreal, which explains why you have third and fourth generation and fifth generation O'Briens, Murphys, Tolls, believe it or not, and haven't a word of English, which is, a fascinating, it's a fascinating sort of little sort of study of demographics. These were children who were brought up culturally as French Canadians, because even though they were born as 5, 6, 7-year-olds, maybe arrived in Grosse Ile without parents. So interesting sort of little side stories of that,
I would say, all the places then, there's only one place that said was actually Irish, Newfoundland, St. John's.
Yeah.
Frankly, they've been there, and there's no false, it's the pure Irish accent.
No, it is. I mentioned Monsterland earlier. There's an amazing piece of television. This is actually true. I was in Canada in 1999, and I was down in Toronto. I flew up to a conference in Cape Breton. And I got out of the airport, got in a taxi, and I went to this motel. And I was getting the bag out of the boot of the thing, and this guy, big fella, like 19 stone, 6'2", comes up out of the thing, and he says, "Are you okay, Fitzgerald? When now did you get in?" And I said to him, I just got off the plane there. I said, "When did you get in?" He says, "My great-great-grandfather came in 1823. He originally, his great-great-grandfather, or great-great-great-grandfather, came to Newfoundland in 1823. And this is 1999, and the accent was pure, Waterford, just pure Munster, And the even more astounding one is that clip, the making of English. I don't know if you've ever seen that. And there's this ostensibly black native Caribbean character sitting on his steps, and they say to him, and when did you hear? And he says, "We came here," he says, "on account of Cromwell." That's about 11 or 12 generations. And that is one of the most interesting, but unfortunately, from an academic research point of view, incredibly intangible thing to ever. How do you study accent transfer? But really, I love to show that clip.
Montserrat is the only island apparently where Negroes have red hair.
Right.
It's true, it actually is true.
If you go down to the next corner, we'll see the Pakistanis and that broad Belfast accent. That's just the same.
I I think we've probably exhausted Paddy at this stage. If anybody's any more questions, but maybe I think we'll give the man a break.
Yeah.
And I'd like you all to show your appreciation.
Sorry I was late, and I'd like to thank Brendan for starting meeting for us. I'd like to thank Paddy for his excellent presentation. He certainly opened my eyes. And I'd like to say thank you all for coming along. Excuse my voice, I've been going through the couple of weeks, but it's good to see this Fitzgerald back again this week. And thank you all for coming. And I think our next night, Brendan, we're going to have this night month, we're going to have a listener Halloween party.
Yes.
We're going to do some of the old games and whatnot.
Yeah, Raymond can explain it.
I let you explain it. And we, of course,
Well, basically, what the idea of it is that we thought that sort of the old traditions, rural traditions anyway, are sort of dying out. The one I think is Marie.
The ducking of the apple.
Ducking of the apple. I don't know that any of this, it's primarily for children, basically, but, and adults, of course, too. But, you hang the apple from a point and you try and take a bite of it.
This is the basin of water.
And then the other one's the basin of water where apples are submerged and you have to take it out with your teeth. That plus other,
Well, we have the rhymers. We're hoping to have the rhymers.
And we're hoping to have the rhymers from Armagh here. So
Just traditional stories, just passing it to the public.
yeah. And I was thinking the next number Dorn Malachy Holland there and Michael Kelly could probably dig through their joint memories and come up with a few other good crack stories. No better man. But you'll see something about it in the local notices and we have a newsletter going out in the next, not this weekend, but next weekend, so you'll read about that.
And we'll be looking help as well.
Yes, we're looking help.
None of us can just keep our own faces on, really.
Well, I can't speak for you, Willie, but I think in my own case, any change is an improvement. But false face making is one of the things that I think those of us who are old enough to remember using newspaper and paste and stuff like that on a clay mould, stuff like that. So that's the sort of thing that we're hoping to sort of teach the young children of today how children played their grandparents possibly when they were children. And I think it's probably no harm that they learn those things,
thank you, Brandon.
Okay.